This is the Dr. Margret S. Ewing Distinguished Lecture Series, and it focuses on looking at bridges between biology and the arts and humanities. It was established in 2009 by Drs. Margret and Sydney Ewing, who are both professors emeritus at OSU. Margret was with the Department of Zoology when I first got here in 2005, and Sid worked in the veterinary parasitology department over at the vet school. And this was the first endowed lecture series that we had in the department. And again, the idea of bridging the sciences and the arts and humanities. And for those of you that don't know Margret, I was just going to mention a few things. Margret actually called and invited me for my interview back in 2005. And she was also the first woman promoted to full professor in the Department of Zoology. So very distinguished. With that, I will introduce Dr. Karen Oberhauser, who is our speaker for today. Karen joins us from the University of Minnesota, and she does a wide variety of things. She received her BA in biology from Harvard University, but she also received a BS in natural science education, and she taught high school for a few years before going on for her PhD from the University of Minnesota. In addition to doing all the normal things one does as a professor, she also directs the Monarchs in the Classroom project, which engages K-12 students in inquiry-based science and involves them doing actual research with monarchs in the classroom. And she's also done a lot of professional development with teachers as well. And part of that program is also the Monarch Larva Monitoring Project, which is an NSF-funded citizen science project throughout the nation, where hundreds of volunteers contribute data, which provides lots of good information on the distribution and abundance of monarchs, and has contributed to lots of publications in various areas of ecology and conservation. She was also the founding officer, one of the founding officers of the Monarch Butterfly Fund, which contributes to research, in particular related to preserving monarchs at their overwintering sites. She's been actively involved in graduate education at the University of Minnesota, including a GK through 12 NSF grant a while back, their IGRT program, and then we were just talking, I guess this shifts back to the teacher education and K through 12 science, but NSF Discovery Research K through 12 program that was recently funded that she'll be working on in the future. And the last thing I was going to mention about Karen was that she was honored last year at the White House as a Citizen Science Champions of Change for the Monarch Larva Monitoring Project. So with that, and of course, numerous publications and lots of interesting research, but I picked the things that I thought were interesting. So with that, I will pass it off to Karen.
There's all sorts of fancy technology up here, which we'll see if I can handle it. It's not very often that I go and give a seminar somewhere else and feel like there's such a friendly audience that I know so many people. It's been a real pleasure today to interact with so many of you, and I feel like I have just a lot of friends out there. So thank you for all of the great conversations that I've had with so many of you today, undergraduates, graduate students, and faculty members. So thanks for being here, and thanks for making my day very enjoyable. So I'm a scientist, and it's a little nerve-wracking to come and give a talk that's supposed to bridge science and the arts and humanities. So I study a very pretty organism. There we cover the art part of this. And I'm going to try, I was going to give a real sciencey, researchy talk, but I'm actually going to focus today on people's relationship with monarchs. So maybe that'll cover the humanities parts of it too, and the science will just be there because I'm a scientist. So I'm also a conservation biologist, even though I got my degree before conservation biology was even a field, or even two words that got put together very commonly. You're nodding, Ray, so you must fit in that category of people too. So I think a lot about the field. When you're in kind of on the beginning of a field, you think about a lot what that means as a field. So I'm trained as a biologist and ecologist. So I think a lot about the knowledge part, that it's very important for us in conserving the world's biodiversity, which is what conservation is, that we need to know, we need to have a lot of knowledge. So we're focused on conserving other organisms, people included, but other organisms as well. We need to know what those organisms need. We need to know how those needs can be met. Why, in some cases, those needs aren't being met, so why an organism might be a focus of conservation actions. And then, what we need to do to assure that they are being met. So those are kind of four very biological and ecological needs. But where conservation biology, at least in my opinion, is different, is that conservation biologists think of action. So we don't just study these things, but we think of how we interact with people to get the things that need to be done to happen. So conservation biology is really a field of action as well as a field of knowledge. But it also is becoming more and more a field of hope. We are bombarded constantly with terrible news about things that are happening in the environment, with climate change and environmental toxins and invasive species and all sorts of habitat fragmentation and things that a lot of you in this room are studying. And those things can really weigh us down. And I don't think any of us would be in the field if we didn't have some hope, because if there's no hope, then all of our hard work is kind of wasted. So I'm coming more and more to think that conservation really requires hope. So with that in mind, and kind of knowing my background here, these are the points I'm going to make. So if you're sitting in the back of the room where it's bright light, or in the front of the room, these are the points if you sort of, your mind wanders for the next 45 minutes. I'm going to talk a little bit about the complex natural history, really exciting natural history of monarchs, and you guys in Oklahoma are right in the center of monarchs right now. Then talk about people's interest in monarchs and how this relationship between people and monarchs is really important for our knowledge and our ability to act, and in some senses our hope for monarchs. However, despite this interest, monarch numbers are declining, so I'm going to give you some data and some graphs on that. Think about some of the reasons for this decline, and then think about, we have this problem that has multiple causes. And it's often difficult to solve problems with multiple causes, because we as humans are used to thinking about addressing one problem at a time. But if that problem is caused by many things, it becomes a little more difficult to plan action strategies. And then think about sort of accepting the reality that we might be really facing a new normal for monarch numbers and numbers of lots of other species as well. So how do we think about that? You know, what do we have as conservation targets? And how are organisms going to survive in situations where there are fewer of them? They might be less dense, they might cover smaller areas. So there's a very different kinds of stresses that might be facing, or that organisms might be facing. Okay, so the natural history, we're going to start now. And when we think about the natural history of monarchs, or their annual cycle, there are really four parts to this natural history. Right now, they're migrating south. So they're covering this huge swath of land, which we call their summer breeding territory. Right now, they're kind of right here. Hardly any left where I come from in Minnesota. There are a lot of them in Oklahoma and this latitudinal belt. They're moving to overwintering sites in central Mexico. There is another fairly distinct, but not completely distinct, population of monarchs that lives west of the Rocky Mountains, overwinters on sites along the coast of California, and then migrates back into that area in the spring. But there is genetic interchange between these two populations, and this can occur, I do have this pointer here, this can occur with monarchs that are moving south out of kind of southwestern Arizona, and those monarchs can actually go to the overwintering sites in California or to the sites in the coast of California. So we know there's genetic interchange there in the overwintering period, and there's also some exchange across monarch populations in the Rocky Mountains. So they're somewhat separate but not completely distinct. So this is happening in the fall. The monarchs get to these overwintering sites starting in about a month, late October, early November. They stay on those overwintering sites. So they have this overwintering period, which is kind of the second phase. They migrate back north, and the monarchs that overwintered in Mexico get kind of into the southeastern quarter of the United States. They lay eggs there, breed, die, and then move back into their summer breeding range. So it's another generation that moves into the summer breeding range, and then they go through 2 to 3 non-migratory breeding generations, and then the cycle starts again. So what's nice about this annual cycle is we have periods at which almost all of the monarchs in each population are clustered together in fairly well-defined, concentrated areas. So we can count them. And we can count them. In Mexico, we measure the area that they occupy. So we just take polygons and measure the area that's actually covered with monarchs. In California, people actually estimate the actual numbers of monarchs that are there. And then we can count them when they first arrive in these overwintering sites, and we can count them just before they leave, so we can get a handle on how many monarchs there are. So this, comparing these numbers to those numbers, is kind of telling us how they do in the wintertime. And then looking at how many arrive there is how they did during the time period that they were breeding in the United States and southern Canada. And a little bit of breeding goes on in northern Mexico. See on that map. So there's the cycle. It's very cool. And I should say, since you're in Oklahoma, that this is kind of the easy version of the monarch life cycle. This is what most of them do, but we know, because we were just out in the fields in Oklahoma, that there is some breeding that monarchs are doing as they move south in the fall. That's happening all the way along this migratory route. We know that most of them probably go all the way from the north to the overwintering sites in Mexico, but not all of them. So that's kind of an interesting thing that's going on. Another interesting thing is that we know that there's some movement. I kind of think of it as they miss that turn to the west when they're coming out of the Appalachian Mountains and get stuck going down the peninsula of Florida, where there's some overwintering in southern Florida and continuous breeding that goes on all winter long, as well as along the Gulf Coast. So there are anomalies or different things that go on, but that's the pattern that the vast majority of monarchs follow. So we can think of this as what they need during all these stages. So as they're migrating south, except for the ones that breed, that need milkweed available, but most of them aren't breeding, so they need roosting sites. They don't migrate at nighttime. They often cluster, so this is a mesquite tree in Texas where monarchs are clustering. They also need nectar sources. They actually gain weight as they're migrating south. If you weigh a bunch of monarchs in Minnesota, weigh a bunch of monarchs in Texas, they're fatter in Texas than they were in Minnesota. So they need energy that's going to fuel their flight and fuel their overwintering period. During the winter, they need the right microclimatic conditions, because the monarchs that overwinter in Mexico live 8 to 9 months, which is a long time for an insect. But the ones that don't overwinter in Mexico, that just breed in the north, live about a month as adults. So they need microclimatic conditions that allow them to stay alive that long period of time. So I often say that they're going to a refrigerator. They're leaving a freezer in the northern part of the country and going to a refrigerator. It's like if you could go into a refrigerator now and, if you're 25 today, you could be pulled out in 10 years and you'd still be 25. But you would miss the next 10 years. So they need the right conditions to let them stay alive all winter in Mexico. As they're moving north, and that picture is Kristen right there, they need milkweed plants, and they're basically following the milkweed north. Little tiny milkweed, Asclepias viridis plants in that picture. They also need nectar as they're moving north, and I put a non-native species kind of on purpose. That's a lilac tree. You guys have lilacs? Yeah. But they're using anything, dandelions, lilacs, spring plants, anything that's available to them. As they're migrating north, as they're breeding in the north, they need vast quantities of milkweed because their population is really hopefully building up over that period, so all different species of milkweed, nectar sources, and then the cycle starts again. So this all happens in the course of a year. They need all of these resources, and if something happens, so that say fewer monarchs survive the winter, so we have fewer of them migrating back and starting that spring migration, very quickly those decreased population sizes cascade through the whole population. So you really need careful monitoring to know where a problem is if the population is smaller, because in just a few months, it's gone through the whole cycle. But even though this is a chain, and in a chain, every single link is important, I like to think that it's the resources that we provide in the north and in the south that is the basis of this whole chain, and that's milkweed plants. So when I go to the overwintering sites in Mexico, which I used to do a lot, I look at all those monarchs and think every single one of them grew up on a milkweed plant. So that's the basis of the whole chain, is this milkweed. Okay, so there's the natural history. People's interest in monarchs. So people have been interested in monarchs for a long time. They're very important in Mexican culture. Well, currently, this is the state of Michoacan, the state that most of the monarch overwintering colonies are in. So this is their license plate. This is their 50 peso bill, which has monarchs in it. They have such beautiful money in Mexico. The arrival of monarchs in Mexico coincides with the Day of the Dead, which is a very important holiday, so people dress up like monarchs. Here's just a picture of the Day of the Dead. It's a huge, huge holiday. And this is something that's been important in Mexican culture for a long time. And the story is that because the Day of the Dead coincides very closely with the arrival of the monarchs, people see these monarchs as the returning souls. This is Humanities.
Yes.
The returning souls of their ancestors. And actually, the whole metaphor of metamorphosis, it's like we have these ugly earthbound creatures that are kind of like worms crawling around and squirming on the ground, and they go into this stage, the pupa stage, which is kind of inert, and they kind of seem like they're dead for a little while, and then they become this beautiful, heaven-bound, winged creature that flies off into new places. So it's kind of often in many cultures a metaphor for rebirth in a new and better form. And that kind of ties in with the Day of the Dead in Mexico. Monarchs, so here's our list, Carl, we were talking about this. Monarchs are the state insect or butterfly of 7 different states in the Union. You could make it happen in Oklahoma.
We've got a good one already.
We did it in Minnesota. You probably remember, many of you, when Jesse Ventura was the governor of Minnesota. So he is the one that signed this statute into law in 1998. And I like to take a little credit for this because I do a lot of outreach for teachers. And a teacher from Matamidi, Minnesota, took a class that I was teaching, a 4th grade teacher, and she went back to her classroom and they were studying how a bill becomes a law. And she said, so how would you like to be a law? And they were raising monarchs, and they said, we want monarchs to be the state butterfly of Minnesota. And so these 4th grade kids passed this law in Minnesota. So this is it. So, and that has happened in more than 10% of the states in the United States have monarchs as their state butterfly or insect. A lot of the others don't have any state butterfly or insect. But, so this is another example of interest. So you probably remember in February, President Obama and Prime Minister Harper and President Peña Nieto in Mexico got together and had lunch, dashed about the Olympics, promised enduring competition, or not competition, cooperation. That was a weird Freudian. But they couldn't agree on trade, they couldn't agree on immigration, but what they agreed on was to create a working group to study ways to protect the monarch butterfly. So they talked about this at this high-level meeting, and this has actually been very important. All three countries now, agencies in all three countries, are supposed to work on how they can save monarchs. On the 26th of August, so about 3.5 weeks ago, there was a petition submitted by the Center for Biological Diversity and the Center for Food Safety to list monarchs as a threatened species. So this is a huge deal. It's up there now. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has their 90-day period to determine if they're going to look into making this officially listed. So that's out there. I'm not going to say more about this. It's occupying a lot of my time right now. If people have questions about it later, I'd be happy to talk with you about it, but that's all I'm going to say now. If you're interested in the petition, I could send you one. Another really cool thing about monarchs that illustrates people's interest is there's this long list, and the different organizations on this list are not the point. The point is the length of that list. These are all organizations that are either monitoring butterflies, the top ones on the list are monitoring butterflies, or monarchs in particular. And most of these projects involve citizens. So there's citizen science projects, people going out and collecting data on monarchs. And these cover every single phase of that 4-step annual cycle that I talked about. So we have an incredible amount of valuable data to help us understand what's going on with monarch populations. And we're really working on trying to put this all together. Kristen mentioned this. The White House recognized, and I wasn't the only person recognized as a citizen science champion of change. There were other people, but it was kind of fun to go get this, and I bought a suit. My only suit. Here's another example. They're one of the citizen science projects. So this is the Journey North project, which is a really cool project where people report their first sighting of different things in the spring, including monarchs. So each one of the dots on this map represents a person seeing a monarch and reporting that monarch to the Journey North website. So we can see, and you can imagine, over many, many years, this becomes really, really interesting as an understanding of how monarchs are responding to climate change, or how they respond to annual variation in weather. It's just weather patterns going up and down. It also shows us, I'm going to look one more time, where we see the monarch, kind of the yellowish dots up to the yellow dots on the bottom are the monarchs returning from Mexico. Then they kind of stay here for a couple weeks, and then they explode into the northern part of the range. So the more reddish and orangish colors are the second generation of monarchs moving northward. So it's incredibly valuable data, and every single one of these is by just a regular person who's not a scientist, but contributing really, really important things. A colleague of mine at the University of Maryland and I have just submitted a paper where we've studied the value of these citizen scientist efforts. So we worked really closely with the people that lead all of these different citizen science projects, and we quantified the amount of time that they contributed to observing monarchs and basically trying to assess the value of the citizen science. So we estimated that in 2011, so that was the last year for which all of these projects had compiled their data, that people spent about 86,000 hours, and that's 41 full-time people. So 41 doesn't sound like a lot, but when you think 40 hours a week for 52 weeks a year times 41, that is an incredible value that we're getting from these projects. And we gridded this into, so each citizen science each project collects their data by location. So you have an observation in a particular location. So this is a 1-by-1 degree grid of the United States showing people's investment in different areas. People are also doing kind of on-the-ground conservation work for monarchs. One of them is creating habitat. This habitat could be at nature centers or in people's backyards or on conservation reserve program land or just natural land that includes milkweed plants. In a lot of cases, they certify this land as monarch way stations. So this is a program run at by the Monarch Watch program at the University of Kansas. So these are registered monarch habitat, where people have said, we have made this habitat and this is for monarchs. So there are more than 8,000 of those throughout the United States. Monarchs are really important in education, both in classrooms in all 3 countries in North America. This is a classroom in Mexico. Getting kids outside to teach them about natural history. These kids are involved in a monarch monitoring project. It's a nature center in Georgia. Taking people in Mexico out to teach them how to monitor the overwintering colonies. So lots and lots of examples of using monarchs as a tool to teach people about science, but also to engage people with nature. This is kind of an interesting one. So this was a whole group of people, including some social scientists, who did what's called a willingness to pay survey. And this is something that allows us to value something that's difficult, whose value is difficult to quantify. So how do you quantify the value of a monarch butterfly? So there are lots of different methods of quantifying that, and one is called a willingness to pay survey, where you randomly talk to people and say, basically, how much would you pay to save monarchs? So we worked with a gardening association to do this random survey, and these are some headlines when this paper came out. People shell out money for monarchs. Americans would pay $4 billion to save monarchs. It's an unusually lovable bug. Which I thought was kind of a good one. People's choice. So lots and lots of examples of different headlines that people came up with. And just to give you an idea, so we estimated from the survey that people would pay $4 billion to save monarchs. So what does that mean? $4 billion. Well, that is how much they would pay to save wolves or whooping cranes. So things that are really familiar to people. They're not bugs. So people value monarchs as much as they value whooping cranes. So that was kind of cool. One of the questions on this survey was, how aware were you that monarch numbers were in decline before reading about it here? So this was an online survey, and this was one of the questions. So we're also kind of interested in looking at the geographical variation in people's interest in and knowledge about monarchs. So here you can see over the United States, and I'd like to take a little bit of responsibility for that big orange blob up in Minnesota. So the 4 different colors it was a Likert scale of not aware, a little aware, all these different categories. So a lot of awareness in the United States. So I think a lot about why this is. In some ways, when we go into biology, some of you study Daphnia or praying mantises, or, you don't really expect everybody in the world to be super interested in your organism of study. And all of a sudden, I was studying this organism. I was interested in sexual selection. And, you kind of don't think about, all these people are interested. So it's kind of interesting. It's humbling in a way. To think about studying this organism that people really care a lot about. It puts some pressure on our shoulders. But it's also kind of curious to me why people care so much about monarchs. I mean, even people how many people in this room, well, this is a bad audience. I'm not going to ask you this question, but, a lot of times people don't even know another insect, a species. They'll say they know a mosquito, but there's a ton of kinds of mosquitoes, or a swallowtail, but there's quite a few kinds of swallowtail. So almost everybody knows a monarch. And they not only know what the adult monarchs looks like, but they know what the caterpillars look like. So that's kind of interesting. So I think part of it is, these are just my theories, I've never studied this, but I think monarchs are really beautiful. So we have this organism that's pretty, and I think people like pretty things, and they're not only pretty when they're an adult butterfly. A lot of butterflies are pretty, but they're really pretty as caterpillars and pupae. I mean, everyone loves, they have necklaces and earrings and all sorts of bling as monarchs, and that's because they're quite beautiful. They're really familiar. Like, I've heard probably 10,000 stories about people's first memory of their first experience with a monarch. Often it happened when they were pretty young, so they're a very familiar species to a lot of people. They're really interesting, so this is maybe what a scientist would say. They're interesting. They've taught us a lot about insect mating systems, interactions between insects and their host plants, animal migration, animal navigation. There's all sorts of things we've learned from monarchs. These are cages we put out to do mating studies in our lab. And also, they're very impressive. A monarch, here's a fun little fact to tell your friends and families. A monarch weighs as much as a paperclip. Not the big kind of paperclip, the little kinds of paperclip. And they can fly over 2,000 miles to these specific sites in central Mexico, which is really an impressive feat. So I think that's something that really connects people to monarchs. So whatever the reason is, we have all these people who are really, really interested in them. And we often feel, I think, as conservation biologists, that we have to say why an organism is important to people. So often we say, they're really important to the ecosystem, they're really important pollinators, and I hear this a lot, but this is not really true. Monarchs are like bees, like those of you that study bees, bees are good pollinators. I mean, they bring pollen to their babies. So their bodies have evolved to carry pollen. They have special hairs and sacs and cool things on their bodies that pick up pollen. Butterflies, some butterflies, not monarchs, a few tropical species of butterflies do eat pollen, but the vast majority of them don't. So they don't have specialized organs on their bodies. They also are not very specific to one kind of flower. So if you're following a monarch around in the field, it might land on a black-eyed Susan and then go to a New England aster and then go to a Liatris or a blazing star. And, they're taking black-eyed Susan pollen to a New England aster, and that's not good for either plant. So it kind of bothers me when people try to sell monarchs as good pollinators and say that's why we should save them. I think we should save them just because they are. That just because they exist, and we have the right to say they don't need to exist because they aren't important to us, or they aren't important to other organisms. So I think they're a good example of a species that we should just save because we don't really have the right to decide what lives and dies, in my opinion. All right, point 3. Despite our interest, monarch numbers are declining. So this is a really depressing graph. This is the area of the winter colonies. Remember I said we can measure the number of acres or hectares that they occupy in Mexico. This is across time. In 2003, 2004, 2005, maybe there was a downward trend, but it has just spiraled downward since then. Just as a little, we have this really high year in the winter that started in 1996. That was the first year I went to Mexico. So it was really amazing to see them in that year. They have natural ups and downs, and the population goes up and down. Most insect populations do. There are a lot of things that drive these numbers, but those years since a decade ago, there was no argument with the fact that the numbers are declining. We can do all sorts of different analyses that show that they're declining. And you can see we've had 3 years in a row with a decline. The last winter was the lowest ever. The winter before that was the lowest ever before that. So it's just, they're declining. We don't argue about that. In California, it's a little bit more complicated. We don't have that decline over the last half decade or so. It's been actually pretty steady for the last half decade. Different things are driving, but certainly the population is a lot lower than it was 15 to 20 years ago now, but it's not doing the precipitous decline that the population in the eastern United States. And this graph is actually showing both the estimate of the total number of monarchs. So you can see it's, the highest was about an estimate of about 1 million monarchs. And it's also showing the average number of monarchs per site. So they monitor a whole bunch of different sites in California. So this is, this has caught a lot of people's attention. And it has been catching people's attention for a long time. So this actually has not been announced yet, the 2014 one. So it's kind of secret news until next week, but I feel like it's okay because you have to go out and publish something there. But the Endangered Species Coalition every year comes out with a list of species that they're calling, that they really want to bring attention to, and monarchs are going to be on their list for 2014. In 2010, the World Wildlife Fund put monarchs in the top 10 species to watch. And way back in 1983, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature put them on their red list, not as an endangered species, but as an endangered phenomenon. The monarch migration, they said, was an endangered phenomenon. All right, that was short. I'd like to keep the depressing part short. Okay, so why is this happening? So this is the many, many reasons for this decline. So for any species, probably the most important thing causing declines is habitat loss. This can either be total habitat loss or habitat conversion. In the United States, we're losing over 5,000 acres of land a day to real estate and energy development. Between 2006 and 2011, we lost more than 1 million acres of native prairie. You know, native prairie that had never been plowed up before, got converted to cropland. And all of this land contained milkweed and nectar plants. So this picture, you know, this is a new development. This is land that didn't have houses on it very long ago. The pessimist in me can look at that picture and be really depressed. The optimist in me can look at it and say, well, there's still some green. And monarchs aren't like wolves where they need, or spotted owls or something that need a lot of habitat. You can get monarchs in your garden. So there aren't a lot of gardens in that picture. And I don't know, we've been kind of noticing there aren't a lot of gardens and there's a lot of land in Stillwater at least that could have a few more native plants on it than we see in people's gardens. So, you know, that could be changed in a year. There could be a lot of habitat in that land if people kind of change their practices. Another thing that's happened is milkweed, the host plant of monarchs, used to grow fairly well within the rows of corn and soybeans. So here's a picture that was converted from a slide, so it's not that great a picture, but I just had a film camera in these days. This is milkweed plants growing in between rows of a cornfield. This is a soybean field. Here's a milkweed plant. There's a monarch laying eggs. So in 2000, I did a study with a whole bunch of colleagues all over the United States. We went out into corn and soybean fields and natural areas, and we measured how much milkweed was in these areas, and we counted how many monarch eggs and caterpillars showed up on these plants. And we estimated that depending on the state and depending on how we did our back-of-the-envelope calculations, that somewhere, kind of around 50 times as many monarchs came out of these ag fields as came out of natural areas. Now that's pretty amazing, but when you think of the Corn Belt, it's not because there was so much milkweed in these ag fields, it's just so much of the Corn Belt is covered by corn and soybeans, and there's just not a lot of natural land left. So that study really changed the way I thought about agriculture. And I thought, well, maybe it's not such a wasteland as I thought. But then along came herbicide-tolerant corn and soybeans, mostly soybeans in the beginning and then corn. So what that meant is that farmers, instead of cultivating these fields, could spray them with Roundup and the milkweed was killed. So this is a very efficient way to control weeds, and we can't really expect farmers not to use an efficient weed control method because weeds are a big problem for farmers. So what this means is we need to figure out a way to replace this habitat. All of this habitat that used to be there a decade and a half ago that's now lost. So this kind of gives us a picture of the impact of this new agricultural technology. So when we did this study in 2000, about 50% of soybean fields, so this is the adoption rate of soybeans and corn, so soybean genetically Roundup Ready soybeans came along first, and they pretty quickly reached about a 90% adoption rate. Corn was not used in fields on a commercial scale until 2004, and now it's about 70–75%. So that's why that habitat is gone to monarchs. And now they're stacking different kinds of herbicides. The EPA just about 3 days ago allowed tolerance to be put into commercial use to Roundup and other kinds of herbicides stacked on each other, because some weeds, but not milkweed, are now resistant to Roundup. Habitat loss is also occurring in other parts of the habitat that the monarch uses during its annual cycle. So there's habitat loss of the overwintering colonies in Mexico, great big trees, little tiny trees that are being cut out. This is, the Mexicans call this ant logging, which is their horse logging. It's like little ants scurrying in and taking out the trees. So you can see the horses bringing the logs down. This is happening right in the overwintering colonies. There are monarchs flying around here. And this, it's a little hard to see here, but this is taken out of an airplane. And this, the mountaintop is called Cerro Pelon. These areas that are cleared now used to be monarch overwintering sites. So they put roads in to these areas, and then they can pull out either the big trees and or the little trees. So habitat loss occurring there too. We're doing the same thing to the overwintering colonies in California. Here are where all the sites are along the coast of California. In the last decade, we've lost more than 10% of those to development. You can guess that is pretty high value real estate along the coast of California. Climate change, different impacts of climate change. One is extreme climate events. So we have these storms that occur fairly infrequently in Mexico, but one of the things that's predicted with climate change is that there will be a higher frequency of extreme events like this. So this particular storm was in the winter of the February of 2002, late January, early February. Usually this is the dry season in Mexico, but there's just a lot of, the climate is just kind of having more perturbations now. And that particular storm killed, we estimated, 80% of the monarchs that were overwintering in Mexico. They were all there, and 80% of them died that winter. So drought is another problem in the upper Midwest and the South, where the monarchs have their first generation. What this means is that the optimum habitat for monarchs might be changing. The location of this habitat might be changing with increased summer temperatures or winter temperatures. So monarchs might need to move farther north to find their optimum temperature, or higher up those mountains. Changing, so this would be impacts on the monarchs themselves. There are potential impacts on the ranges of milkweed or the oil fir trees, which are the trees that they mostly overwinter on in those sites in Mexico. It could lead to altered timing of their predators or parasitoids. So just like when we're studying the impacts of climate change on other organisms, these are some of the potential effects on monarchs. And many other factors. I'm talking about insecticides today. Invasive species, there's an invader that is closely related to milkweeds. It's a Synantium species, Synantium nigrum, that female monarchs will lay their eggs on, but the caterpillars can't develop on. So it's kind of a sink. We're seeing increased disease incidence. So this is Ophriocistis electroscura, or OE. These are scales of monarchs, and these are little spores that indicate the presence of this disease. For some reason, we don't know why, the incidence of this disease is increasing. And a guy called me about a month ago and said, I know where monarchs are going extinct is because we have so many east-west highways in this country, and as they're migrating south, they're getting hit by cars. So, many, many causes. I think the cars probably aren't the biggest one. So what do we do? how do we respond to this problem with many causes? This is how we should not respond. We should not say there's nothing we can do. That, in my opinion, is not an option, since it would just be impossible to address all these things. We also should not point fingers. That was happening for a long time between the US and Canada and Mexico, because people were saying in Mexico they're cutting down all the trees and we're losing all this habitat for monarchs, and now Mexico is just pointing those fingers right back and saying you're planting all these Roundup-ready crops, and they don't plant GMOs in Mexico. They are really nervous about them. So there's kind of a lot of cross-border arguing, which is kind of non-productive. Also, we get a lot of people saying, well, insecticides may kill some monarchs, but they're such a minor cause that it really doesn't pay to address, to worry about that cause, because there are bigger things we should be worrying about. I think if there's something an individual person can do, they should do it, even if it's maybe not one of the bigger causes. So I'd like to kind of go back to the beginning and say, so what do we need to do to preserve monarchs? And think back, what do we need? We need knowledge. So we need to keep monitoring monarchs to assess the population status. And this will help us document both declines, the depressing things, but also hopefully our successes. So this year, there are more monarchs. So we need to figure out why. What happened? Maybe all this habitat work we're doing is starting to help. Maybe it's just a good weather year. So we need to be able to figure out what's going on, and that requires a lot of monitoring data. Then we need to use that information to kind of drive experiments. What factors affect monarch survival or movement or reproductive success? And this work is going on right here in Oklahoma with, how important is it to burn rangeland and make that milkweed available for monarchs in the fall? So, that has right direct conservation applications. Potential impacts of climate change. How do we plan for conservation in the face of what we know is going to happen to the climate? And then we need to act on that knowledge. So we need to address habitat loss. We need to make sure that the nectar and the milkweed resources that monarchs need are available to them. We need to preserve the overwintering sites. We need to preserve what's there. We need to augment it because we've lost a lot. Again, we need to plan for climate change. We need to educate people, get the kids involved. This is kind of cool. This is a milkweed field. That guy is cultivating milkweed and growing milkweed to produce seeds. Support organizations working to preserve monarchs and pollinators. So these are the kinds of things that individual people can do and researchers can do. Any level of people can get involved with these actions. And then the hopeful part for me is the fact that there is all this attention on monarchs. So again, there's a long list up here. The point is not what's on the list, the point is the length of the list. Each country in North America and cross or international efforts is working in many different ways to preserve monarchs. And the presidential memorandum that President Obama signed in May of this year was really important to get people and agencies and NGOs involved in monarch conservation. So I would like to talk a little bit about an effort that I'm involved with that's called the Monarch Joint Venture. So some of you might be familiar with bird joint ventures. It's kind of an idea of getting a lot of organizations together that are interested in a common goal, a common conservation goal. They're called joint ventures, stealing a word from the business community. So these are all of the organizations that are involved in the Monarch Joint Venture. NGOs, government agencies, and some academic institutions. And we have a vision, abundant monarch populations that can be sustained into perpetuity. It's great to have a vision that includes perpetuity. It's such a great word. Our work is based on a conservation plan that was written in published, I think, in 2007, which brought together people from all 3 countries in North America to come up with a plan for conserving monarchs. And this is available online, but we went through that plan. We said, what can we achieve in the United States, and who are the best organizations to carry out that work? And we just made assignments. You know, we just said, you can do this, and you can do this, and here's some support to do this, and all based on this plan. So we have goals. So we're working in areas of habitat conservation, education and outreach, and research and monitoring. So I'm just going to kind of give you some examples of the work, and we're not saying anything is too small. So we're promoting habitat conservation in large scale, like CRP, Conservation Reserve Program plantings. Roadsides are kind of controversial. They're wonderful corridors. You know, there's not many places you can go in the United States that are very far from a road. Some monarchs, like the guy told me when he called me a month ago, do get killed because they come, you know, they're along roadsides and then a car comes by and kills them. But my guess is there's probably a net benefit to monarchs from habitat along roadsides. And then here's a school in Minnesota. So basically what we're doing is trying to get more milkweed that the caterpillars can eat and more nectar sources out on the landscape that will be available for monarchs where and when they need them. We have a lot of milkweed seed increase project work going on. So this is that same field that that guy was cultivating in the other picture. I don't know why they wear white suits when they go out and do this, but this is a whole field of milkweed that is grown specifically to produce the seed. And what we did is we assigned priority states where native milkweed plants aren't available. So these are the states we're working in, and these are the Monarch joint venture partners that are working on all this work. We've made a list of priority milkweed species for all of the different regions of the United States. So these are species that are native to each region and we know are important to monarchs. So people can see what species of milkweed they'll plant. We've made lists of pollinator plants that monarchs use and that would be available throughout the breeding season and the migratory time periods in different regions of the United States. And lots of other things. Specific prairie reconstruction projects, working with the Iowa DNR. There is a little bit of land in Iowa that's not covered by corn or soybeans. Not much, but a little. So all different kinds. So milkweed installations in right-of-ways, utility right-of-ways, corporate landscapes. We got monarchs listed as a species of greatest conservation need in Minnesota, and that's actually kind of important because the state natural resource agencies can't devote any money to organisms that aren't listed as species in need. So that's kind of a big deal to get that done. Promoting research and monitoring with the understanding that to understand monarch populations, we need broad temporal and spatial scales. We can't just do it in individual research labs. We're trying to join these efforts across the whole huge range of monarchs and trying to promote more citizen engagement. So here's some examples of getting people involved. Monarch tagging programs and just getting as many people out onto the landscape looking at monarchs in general. I like this picture. Sometimes I think that our biggest demographic is little old ladies in tennis shoes. There's one. That's going to be me pretty soon. We're doing a lot of work. There's not been as much attention on the western migratory population as on the eastern migratory population. So our partners in California or in the West, the Xerces Society, are comparing images of habitat from the past and current images to see what's happening to these overwintering sites. And at first glance, they don't look that different, but you can see right where this line of trees used to be that monarchs actually overwintered. Now there's two nice buildings right there. So they're quantifying that habitat loss, trying to see what they can do to stem the changes. They're pulling this together in a big database. So looking at data both on the sites themselves and the number of monarchs that are in all of these sites, and that was kind of a messy database before, so they're pulling it into one big database. Lots and lots of education outreach projects, kids, adults, written things, citizen science workshops, just getting people to give these workshops in areas where we've identified data gaps in all these monitoring programs where the dots on that map I showed you before are small. We want to make them big, so getting more people involved. We call it North American Monarch Institute, so these are workshops that we're doing. So far we've done them in Minnesota, Chicago, Atlanta, and Washington, D.C. to get teachers taking their kids outside, getting their kids observing monarchs and other organisms. And lots of resources, including this great visual of the monarch migration, that nice poster which is downloadable on our website, so all sorts of different resources. We could go on and on. Monarch Festivals, every year we have a Monarch Festival in Minneapolis that they had, I don't know how many thousand people came, do you know? 10,000?
That's what I hear.
10,000 people in Minneapolis. Carl knows. He talked to all of them. Came and learned all sorts of great things about monarchs. So I said conservation requires knowledge, action, and hope. I think it also requires realism. And I think we all need to accept in whatever field we're not, in our lifetimes, no matter how young you are in this room, there have been huge changes in biodiversity. Everyone in this room was alive when the monarch population was a lot higher than it is now, and a lot of other organisms. Monarchs, even though I've been studying monarchs for 30 years, I'm not just thinking we need to save monarchs and nothing else. I think monarchs are a flagship species. They're something that engages people. So these same things are happening to countless other things that we're not counting. We just don't know about them. So what does that mean for us as people who care about biodiversity, that there's not going to be as much around? And I didn't think so much about this question until I was talking to a reporter a little bit a while ago, and he said, so what is it going to mean for monarchs when people don't see them when they're little kids? And that really, I thought I'd gotten every question that a reporter would ever ask me. But that one had, I had to just stop and think, whoa, I don't know the answer to that. So I think we need to think about that. What does it mean? What is this kind of new normal, lower numbers of things? So we're not going to see repeats of the numbers that were common just a decade ago. So nobody in this room is younger than 10. So we really need to work to maintain public interest in monarchs, or cross that out and fill in the blank of any other species. How do we get people to care about conservation when they're not seeing these things as much as they used to? So I think that means we need to work a little harder to ensure that these new numbers are sustainable, both in terms of human interest. So that's where this humanities and arts and the sciences comes in, is human interest in these things is really, really important. Also, it's the human interest, but it's also lower numbers. So we all know from our ecology classes and basic biology that if a population is high and a big proportion of them die, there's still going to be quite a few left. But if a population is low and a big proportion of them die, there's going to be, there might be an unsustainable number left. So we don't know what that number is for monarchs. All the agency people keep asking it, but we don't know what that number is. And I think that in the end, we need to believe that all of our efforts will be worthwhile. So monarchs exist in this really cool mosaic of common and disturbed habitats. Milkweed can grow between cracks in a sidewalk, and very rare and pristine, these few acres of native prairie that are left. So that's, I think, to our advantage, that we can preserve lots and lots of different kinds of habitats. They're really interesting organisms from which we still have a lot to learn. And they have this incredible migration that's an unmatched biological phenomenon. So with that, I this talk, involves a lot of people. This is a group of many of my students who got together for the first time a couple years ago, but many, many different organizations and people, citizen scientists. I'm a terrible photographer, so these are people who have contributed pictures to this talk. So thanks to everybody. I stand on the shoulders of giants.
That's the graph you showed of the ups and downs of populations in Mexico, the population, the number of hectares occupied. That's practically bouncing around practically close to zero. If it ever hits zero, has anybody modeled this to see, like, for example, how many, what's the 95% probability of living another 10 years as a species?
Well, as we all know from calculus, you can take a half, you can keep fluctuating a long time and getting smaller and smaller, and then you can go to infinity and never, an infinite number of times and never hit zero. We don't know.
But 5 hectares or something, less than 5 hectares.
Yeah, last year was 0.67 hectares.
That's close to the
yeah.
extinction, isn't it?
Well, there's still millions. I mean, there are still a lot of monarchs. And monarchs, so, I said I was just telling you the story of most of them, but there are many different things that happen. So, for example, there are a lot of monarchs that stay along the Gulf Coast during the winter time, southern Florida. My personal opinion is that we probably are never going to wipe out monarchs. We as people have moved monarchs all over the globe. We've moved them to New Zealand and Australia and Hawaii and other Pacific islands and islands in the Gulf Coast. They're now in southern Spain and Portugal. So we plop them down in these weird places and they adapt. They do the right thing. You take a monarch and you stick it in Hawaii and it all of a sudden does the right thing. And in Australia, it migrates in response to drought instead of response to cold. So I think they'll adapt, but hopefully they won't have to change too much. Hopefully that migration will still continue, that incredible overwintering phenomenon. But I think your guess is as good as mine as to what is the minimum number they can reach. And the federal agency people, keep wanting us to say numbers. They want that too. Like, what's the sustainable overwintering size? And, I could pull a number out of my ear and 5 hectares, who knows? 10, 5, 1, I don't know. But, there might be a smarter modeler than me that could figure that out, but you'd have to be smarter than me. That's not that hard, but, okay.
In Mexico, they're in the mountains of Michoacan where they overwinter. And so that makes them a montane species. And many montane taxa with global warming have increased their elevation. You mentioned that. However, I remember when I walked up to those colonies, it seemed like it was at the top of the mountain. Is there still mountain left? And even if there is there still habitat that they need in order to survive a little higher?
So that is an excellent question. So his question, if you didn't hear that in the back, can they move up? And no. On the mountains that they're on now, they often are at or near the top of those mountains, but there are other mountains so it's and we've modeled that. We've modeled the microclimatic conditions that they're using now. And there are actually some people that are promoting the idea of assisted migration and trying to move YML fir trees into areas where they don't currently grow, but would be climatically appropriate for them and for monarchs, in a few decades, when the climate changes, a few decades. So there are other areas, but not the specific mountaintops that they're using.
So they'd have to switch just a little bit. Plus the trees would have to grow bigger because they use really big trees. That overwinter.
Yeah, so there are people, among my ecologist friends, they're really nervous about assisted migration, but as a pragmatic conservation biologist, that might be what we have to do in the face of climate change. It's very controversial. Moving those fir trees to areas where they don't currently grow.
But with global warming, they could have.
Yeah.
So I had a comment, maybe kind of a broader question, and you said that monarchs are beautiful, and I, for some reason, never found it that. And, I thought some of the tropical butterflies or the blood-feeding ones were a lot cooler, but so I teach invertebrate zoology, and I have the students read Stephen Jay Gould's book, It's a Wonderful Life. And, I Google these fossils in there, and I would find, like, people would make earrings out of some of them, and I thought, this is really weird. And so for one of the writing assignments, I said, okay, folks, pick your favorite invertebrate in this massive 80-page chapter, and go Google it and see how it infiltrated common culture. And so they picked all these different ones, and certain ones were, like, really, really common. People in Halloween costume, earrings. There's a rock band that has a whole album about some of these. And so I asked them why, in there. And some of them said, oh, this just looks really cool. And there's 6 different versions of Pokemon that uses these video games or whatever, uses these fossils. And then some of them said, well, it just has a really cool name, Waxia, this really boring snail thing, right? It looks kind of weird. And I was like, how can you actually, use that kind of stuff for conservation, right? Because all of a sudden, people seem to care, and these are fossils, they're not alive, no one, and so there's none of that bias stuff, right? But these monarchs seem to appear in books, in grade school books, right? So some of that somehow got in there. Do you think there's some way to do that with other organisms, right? We actually do that with our oyster worms because they're gross, so when people find it, you can send them.
Next question. Save question.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, I work on monarchs, so. I've gotten that question, I feel like it's up to the people that study the other things to make the Daphne out of the, all those other, I don't know about horsehair worms, you gotta, that's an uphill climb, but, in some ways, seriously, maybe we don't need that many species. Maybe it only takes a few. Maybe if people care about one, that's enough. Maybe if they care about one organism deeply, that's all we need. And, if it's going to be monarchs or wolves or horsehair worms or whatever, I think we just need to make the connections. Maybe for some it's a flower, for some it's bluebirds. I think we don't need that many.
But it seems like some are just so, people just like them. For some almost like genetic, it's like religion or something, right? I'm not saying anything, but.
Yeah, no, I mean, I really like monarchs. I've studied monarchs for a long time, but I have met people that are a little kooky about monarchs. They are a little over the top. And yeah, it is like a religion.
Or horsehair worms. So with the data that you were saying, like with the houses, and you look at that, you see their yards, and you're like, oh, it's great, maybe. Has anyone, looked at like milkweed sales from the major companies that sell it, or the sales in general, if it has gone up or gone down? And is that helping?
That's a really interesting question. I don't know if anybody has looked at that. When we know with the Monarch Larva Monitoring Project too, we know that a lot of people are monitoring gardens and they see a lot of monarchs in these gardens. So we know they're using them on a bigger scale of their relative importance compared to other kinds of habitat. They're not that important, but in some ways, from that picture, people argue, well, we're never going to get enough habitat from lawns, but really, there are a lot of acres of lawn, and basically that is really wasted habitat. I mean, a monoculture of Kentucky bluegrass it's not being used for ethanol, it's not being used to feed cattle, it's basically a monoculture of an invasive plant. So it's a lot of potential that could quickly be converted.